Now, when the decision was announced, a Mississippi Congressman, John Bell Williams, on the floor of the U.S. Congress called it a Black Monday in the history of the United States, and Williams would later serve as governor of Mississippi in 1968 to 72. So the year should tell you there. John Bell Williams was governor in Mississippi when Robert E. McNair was governor in South Carolina. There were some attempts to begin desegregating schools across the American South in the 1950s, most noted perhaps Central High in Little Rock, which became a national cause célèbre. Governor Alba Forbes, who would be that state's governor for 12 years, interposed the authority of the state between federal courts and the Little Rock schools, a word that was much used by many Southern governors, not in South Carolina, but in Georgia, Alabama, Virginia, Mississippi, Florida, and Arkansas. Interposed the authority, a word that had not been used in political science or historical or legal circles since 1860. This led to President Eisenhower calling in the 101st Airborne Division, nationalizing the Arkansas National Guard, and protecting the students who were assigned, the African American students who were assigned to Central High School at Little Rock. Although the next year, the school was closed. 2 years later in New Orleans, courts ordered desegregation of schools in that city, and basically mob rule took over New Orleans as local authorities did absolutely nothing to calm a volatile situation. In Virginia, there was what was called massive resistance to the Supreme Court decision, which meant closing all the schools rather than desegregate. Now keep some of these in mind as we go forward. Closing down schools, massive resistance, mob rule, Louisiana, Virginia, Arkansas. Then we come to the 1960s themselves, and let's look at what was going on nationally. In August 1963, there was the March on Washington, when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been proposed by President John F. Kennedy, pushed through by Lyndon B. Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy upon his death, which outlawed discrimination in public accommodations, and more importantly, authorized the Department of Justice to file suits to facilitate the desegregation of schools. And the following year came the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which provided for direct federal intervention in the registration process of voters. And South Carolina, unfortunately, was furnishing some examples. If an African American went to register to vote, whether it was here or even in North Carolina or Virginia, Florida, it was not all be a line of white people and then an African American, and when the African American got to the window, the shade would come down and say, office closed. That was prevented by the Voting Rights Act. And I experienced firsthand what my native state of Alabama did to keep people from voting. I went down to register to vote after I turned 21. Alabama had a law for registering voters is you just couldn't walk down to register to vote. A registered voter had to accompany you to the registrar's office, which of course meant working people really didn't have much chance to vote. My grandmother, my mother's mother, took me down and she was irate. This hadn't happened when she had gotten to vote in the 1920s. She had just gone down very proudly to register to vote. But she had to accompany me. And then there were two boxes sitting on the registrar's desk. And I was told to just pull a piece of paper out of it. Well, these were tests that Alabama had for potential voters. And the professors Black are sitting here. I pulled out a one-page, single-spaced, there was two paragraphs from the Alabama State Constitution. And I was supposed to explain this to what this meant to the satisfaction of the registrar before I could vote. Now, I thought I was a pretty smart kid from Davidson. I did take political science as a minor, but I read this legal gobbledygook, and I could come up with the trite answer now is, this means I don't get to vote. Because what this if you were a person of color, that's what was handed to you. If you were white, you got something like, what's our name? What's the name of our state or name of a county? Something very, very, very simple. So I learned firsthand as a young undergraduate what had been going on in our native Southland for generations. In April 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, which led to violence in many parts of the country. Blessedly, in South Carolina, there were church services, there were marches, but thanks to Governor McNair, there was relative calm. Now, elsewhere in the American South in the 1960s, Ross Barnett is the governor of Mississippi. This is when Ole Miss erupts in violence as James Meredith tries to become the first African-American student there. In April 1960, race riots erupt in Biloxi when African-Americans attempted to use the city's all-white beaches. And at Ole Miss, the National Guard had to be called out again, or federalized, after several people were killed in rioting on campus as federal marshals tried to register Meredith. Lieutenant Governor Paul Johnson, who would later become governor in 1964, succeeding Ross Barnett, in the front of local TV cameras would literally block Meredith's pass on campus, and his campaign slogan, which carried him into office, was "Stand Tall with Paul." That's the kind of mentality you had in certain parts of the South. And then we get to my native Alabama. John Patterson was governor when the Freedom Riders came through in 1962. In Anniston, Alabama, a bus was burned as shots were fired, first of all putting out the tires, then the bus was burned, and as the Freedom Riders tried to flee the burning bus, they were assaulted. In Birmingham, the riders were assaulted with chains and baseball bats, and the police strangely didn't appear until after most riders were seriously injured. Then from Birmingham to Montgomery, under the state troopers, they traveled in safety till they got to Montgomery. When the state troopers disappeared, again they were assaulted, and while they were being assaulted, the Attorney General of Alabama was standing over prone Freedom Riders, serving an injunction saying that it was unlawful for them to be in interracial groups to travel in the state of Alabama, ignoring the carnage that was going on. Now again, keep these images in mind and compare that to what is, and more importantly, what is not going on in South Carolina at the same time. And of course, we have the Wallace Administration, the first George Wallace Administration from 1963 to 67. There were civil rights demonstrations in Birmingham in April and May of 1963, which created a national furor. This is Bull Connor, the local police official using fire hoses and police dogs on national television. Eventually, 3,000 federal troops have to be sent in to maintain law and order. And then, in that summer, George Wallace stands in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama with the usual speech about states' rights, which includes the following phrase. And it's 4 pages long, but I'm just going to give you a snippet. "My action is not defiance for defiance sake, but for the purpose of raising basic and fundamental constitutional questions. My action seeks to avoid having state sovereignty sacrificed on the altar of political expediency." Well, after he made his speech for the TV cameras, he stood aside, and persons of color were registered at the University of Alabama. But unfortunately, Alabama's shame was not yet through. March 1965 was Selma, with the assault on the marchers trying to march from Selma to Montgomery. And once again, the National Guard had to be federalized, this time by President Johnson, to maintain law and order. In every situation, law and order has broken down with pretty much the aiding and abetting by the political figures. Again, I don't want to beat my image, but I think you need to keep this in mind. What is happening elsewhere in neighboring states, but what is not happening in South Carolina.